Our second topic is the local government, and it has 4 modules: organization, contacts and meetings, emergency operations, and potential events. During the darkest days before World War II really had entered the United States, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave a speech in which he outlined the 4 freedoms, the 4 reasons in essence why the Allies would be fighting against the Axis powers. He says, ours is a fight for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Today, we have many threats to freedoms. And again, you can read those lists. I don't want to dwell here and take time to go into all of the negatives that is going on in our world. Just be aware there are many threats to freedoms. Things haven't changed much since World War II. And consequently, a community, a group of people, a gathering of strangers, as I said, organize and form for a purpose. This applies to any agency, institution, or organization. There is a central purpose around which it gathers. I like this quote, though, that says a government or a community big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. And so when we look at this community, 3 things stand out as basic to every group or organization or agency or institution. Ends, that is, determining the purpose and envisioning the end state, the desired goal. And then ways, how we define our objectives and the methods we use to reach them. And then means, what resources and training is required. How do we obtain those resources and training, and how do we apply resources as a means to the ways and ends? Because, and this is my own phrasing, and maybe it's not original, I don't know, I haven't ever heard it before, vision without resources is hallucination. Did you catch that? Vision without resources is hallucination. They're absolutely essential to make the ends happen. And so in every organization, every community, there are elected officials or appointed officials. Leaders who are responsible for a vision and direction, for baking that a pie, for security and safety, and for the well-being of community and its members. Let's look at that API that I've mentioned now a couple of times. It's an acronym meaning A for assessment, which we've talked about in greater detail. Second, a P for plans, and an I for implementation, and an E for execute, or more importantly, evaluation. Assessment of the needs in the greater community. Assessment of the available resources and the priorities for the good of the overall community. And then planning the vision and the desired outcomes, ways you can accomplish those objectives. Implementation involves marketing the programs and expending the necessary resources to make them happen, as well as executing the plans to completion. Evaluation is accountability and reporting to the public. Feedback and changes or correction as needed. All of this has to occur on a recurring cycle. And it happens through the 3 C's. That is communication, coordination, and collaboration to achieve cooperation. Without those, if there's a failure to communicate, people can make assumptions and move out on a program that doesn't have backing, or nobody knows where it's going. And of course, that involves coordinating with all of the various elements of that community and collaborating to make the desired changes and goals. An organization, a community also has citizens or members. Now, they're part of it, not because they usually have a grand desire to support everything that the leaders want, but rather to meet their own needs. They pay their taxes, yes, they provide some support when required, but through corporate effort, they've learned to cooperate and graduate. You remember those days in school? You cooperated and you graduated. So you have officials and leadership, you have members and citizens over here. And in between, there is what is called the chaplain. He is a liaison between the 2 groups. It's not an either or, but it is a both and. He represents the interest of leadership to members. He represents members' concerns to leadership. He is the middleman, the bridge, the liaison between. So there are public laws that govern chaplaincies in many situations, particularly for military, the police, and other first responders, and in the prisons. So what kind of qualifications, if any, does agencies require of applicants? Well, sometimes there's age limitations. Sometimes there's citizenship requirements, educational levels, specialized training, and in the cases of the military and the police, some kind of physical condition. In certain cases, what is called ecclesiastical endorsement by a faith or religion is required. But most importantly, you as an applicant or as a chaplain need to understand organizational development, how that group formed and its identity, its growth, and any institutionalism that has developed over the years, whether there is fragmentation when crisis occurs, or whether it has refocused its purpose and stabilization. And then look at the institutional and organizational structure, its raison d'etre, its reason for existence, its leadership and workers, and its clients. Know its heritage and its emerging culture. The second element of local government is organization. I like this quote from a past president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He said, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Well, is government really helpful? Local government refers to that degree of freedom to decide and act within a defined area of a state. And that defined area has many different names depending on the country from which you're from. A bureau, a county, a Gemeinden, a Kreis, a municipality, a parish, a province, a township, a Zemstvo, etc. There are basically 2 types of local government. There is the deconcentration type. That is, they exist as an administrative body loyal representatives to a ruling central government. They're simply a part of the centralized way of reaching down to the citizen at the local level. Then there is the decentralization type of local government, where the authority actually rests in the people who can decide within a council or a local elected persons who can act on their own discretion with officials they themselves freely appoint and can even discipline. Within a local government are often many different departments: education, health, welfare, social, child protective services, for instance, registration and licensing, elections, agriculture, conservation and environment, public works, including roads, streets, landfill, and utilities, and then public safety, all of your law enforcement agencies, your fire departments, your emergency medical technicians, and so forth, and the Emergency Operations Center. It's all somewhat convoluted when you stop and think about it, because the local government is mixed in response from a higher centralized authority, and yet it's trying to be responsive to immediate needs in a very smaller area. It's convoluted for a number of factors. We have the speed of communications today. We have growth of economic plans and industries, and an inefficiency of huge centralized governments. And we could go on and on. This is not a lesson in civics, but the point I'm wanting to make is this: church and state mix. What? That seems so counter to Adventist thinking. But hear me out. Chaplains must know how their governments function or don't function, and who has the authority to make decisions, particularly on the local level. We all know generally the president or the king or the ruling premier in a country. But do we know that regional county supervisor, and I'm using the term here in the States, with all 3,800 counties in our country? Probably not as familiar. In the United States, and I have to use this as an example because that's what I'm familiar with, but liken it to something similar in your country. We have what is called Homeland Security. After the terrorist attacks on 11 September in 2001, we had many different agencies that really had insights to something disastrous that was going to occur, but no one was talking to each other. They were not interconnected. And consequently, the event, the tragedy, the terror of that day struck, and 3,000 people lost their lives. Since then, we have formed what is called Homeland Security and made it a U.S. cabinet level department. And I'm sure that you have a Department of the Interior or a Homeland Ministry in your country. Now 22 different federal agencies have come together to provide a single service for averting terroristic responses and activities and threats, and to provide security and respond to disasters, including pandemics such as COVID-19. The DHS employs around 250,000 workers and has an annual budget of $52 billion. So what I'm suggesting is know your national level government agency and how it filters down to the local level, and who has responsibility for emergency crisis response. In America, part of the Homeland Security Department is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It was created in 1979, and it only responds if a state governor declares a state of emergency and formally requests whoever the president may be at the time to provide federal help. Too often we always hold the person accountable who happens to be president, when in reality it is usually at a state or even a lower level, county or city level here in America, who are making those kind of decisions. And FEMA gets involved if a disaster occurs on federal property, such as a national park or a national forest or in a military base or something similar of that nature. It provides expertise in specialized fields in rebuilding efforts and providing relief funds, particularly through the Small Businesses Administration. And it trains response personnel throughout the nation. In fact, you, listening audience, can avail yourselves of many free courses available online. Now, enrollment is open to a limited number of international students as well. And when you complete the course, a certificate is awarded. After passing, there is an exam for each course. And if you pass it, you get a certificate of completion. From FEMA, there is a state emergency operations center, and in every county in the United States, there is a local emergency operations center. One per county, all 3,800 or so of them. There is a central command and control facility with an incident commander. In that person, he has charge of coordinating and coalescing all of the resources necessary to respond. He is responsible for the emergency preparation and planning, the management of the response, collecting, gathering, analyzing the data, how much of the county is underwater, or how many utility lines are down, or how many acres are on fire, etc. And he makes strategic direction, the decisions necessary to protect life and property. A lot of power at a very local level. These are operational decisions to maintain continuity and to disseminate information through the communication center. Now, you're saying, I'm going to rush out and join the EOC. Well, they rarely engage in tactical operations or do the frontline face-to-face relief work. If you're imagining that you as a chaplain will be handing out food and blankets or visiting and counseling with victims of a crisis, if you work through the local EOC, you may be disappointed. If your NGO or your church wishes to get involved, they need to clearly define what it can offer in a disaster to the EOC as part of the preparation and planning, not after an incident has already started. You're too late then. So you are interfacing and coordinating non-government assistance, especially by educating volunteers by CERT. What is CERT? It's another acronym. A Community Emergency Response Teams. This is where your community chaplain can be part of that response, of CERTs. They also are part of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. You're probably familiar with that term because ADRA overseas, Adventist Development Relief Agency, is considered a non-government organization, an NGO. Same as Adventist Community Services here in North America. They then have set up a standard for an emotional and spiritual care provider. That is not necessarily the same as a chaplain. Chaplains should meet the requirements to be either a Red Cross spiritual and emotional provider or through ACS. And ACS controls that aspect of it. The International Critical Incident Stress Foundation is another NGO that works around the world, along with the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, NVOAD, okay? And the Red Cross or St. John's, the international organizations, or the Red Crescent, all of these. There is another element to an emergency local operational center, and that is Faith Communities in Action, FCIA. Be aware that none of these are substitutes for official government action. Rather, they are an adjunct, a supplement to support government agencies. And I've provided a handout that talks about FCIA and what it can do and how you can become a part of it and how it can help. When we look here at emergency management, there are 4 distinct parts that go into an evolving, rotating, never-ending cycle. And the 4 parts are mitigation or prevention, preparedness, response, and then lastly, recovery. And we could look at those in greater detail, and they're on the slides spelled out what is each involved in each of those 4 phases. They are not compartmentalized. They're often ongoing and again interrelated, and sometimes not occurring necessarily sequentially, but are taking place sometimes simultaneously. Just be aware of the 4 in particular. Here's where I want to take you as a chaplain. When a crisis occurs, what do you expect? You've been called out now. You've been identified as a chaplain. You're part of a agency or the community or a pool, and you're called out. What is happening at a critical emergency incident or an unexpected disaster? First of all, confusion and chaos, disbelief and traumatic shock, strong emotional reaction that interferes with coping. And understand this, that people at the scene, on the scene, often provide first response prior to the arrival of first responders, who are the official people like police and fire and so forth. Minutes or even hours may pass before official help arrives. And so assistance after disaster continues, not only through that day, but for weeks and even months. As a police chaplain, we're often on the scene very rapidly, and we stay for a short time to accomplish what we need to do, and we depart. But I had the privilege of going out on a large fire scene. And there, they planned to be there for a day or 2 days, maybe, for a large building fire. They even set up a little commissary to feed the firefighters, and because they know they're going to be there for a long time. And sometimes, in the recovery aspect, life may never fully return to the way things were. Think about the tsunamis that happened over the past few years. Things have not been fully restored. Life is not back to what we would call the way it was, normal. And then lastly, a security zone must be established to protect victims from curious onlookers and keep unqualified help from interfering with rescue work. Let me give you an example. I work at a very large international airport, and I'm a member of what is called the FAST team, Family Assistance Stress Trauma Team. If, God forbid, an airliner were to go down at that airport, crash, We have done drills a couple of times a year where we simulate how would we respond to this as chaplains, as officials at the airport. We learned lots of things in these drills. Surprising. And guess who is in charge? The airline, not the airport officials necessarily. That plane belongs to the airline. And they're responsible for the immediate reaction. As chaplains, we're dealing with mostly the families and friends of those people on the airplane. We're dealing with them immediately at the airport, and as fast as we can, we bus them to an undisclosed location nearby. It's actually in a close-by hotel. And there we set up processing for them. Very interesting, a security cordon blocks off that airport, and nobody but 32 members of this FAST team get on or off. In one of the exercises, an amusing little incident happened. A pregnant woman fainted. And you should have seen the real life reaction. It took us about 8 to 10 minutes to get a medical help there, because we were in a very remote part of one of the terminals, to get her some medical assistance and get her moved out of there. She was one of the actors in the play that we were doing for the day, but she had a real life emergency. And it was amazing to see what that one little incident took place and how we reacted and responded to that. What I'm trying to share with you is this, that when a crisis occurs, you must be prepared and be part of a trained response, be part of the officially recognized chaplaincy, to be included, to even be allowed into the area to provide ministry and help at that time. And then it might be apart from that scene in a different location where you're dealing with the family, with the friends, with victims, etc. You're not there to pull people out of a burning plane, for instance. There will be emergency crews trained to know how to do that right there at the airport. You may have a totally different role than what you expected. Think about these things. We've only just brushed the surface of some of these issues. One of the important things that you want to do as a prospective community chaplain is set up meetings and make contacts with local leaders in your government. Face-to-face meetings are vital. So learn who your community current leaders are, and then prepare yourself spiritually to meet them like Nehemiah did. He prayed, he had clear vision and intent when he went in to see Artaxerxes, the king, about the issues he had and concerns for Jerusalem. Learn about the person you're going to go meet, and then establish an appointment. You may be rebuffed for a while. Who are you? What do I need to see you for? But eventually, a good civic leader will make time to spend a few minutes with you. It helps if you send a bio ahead of time so they know who you are and a little bit about you. And then dress appropriately professionally and be on time. Ask questions when you go in. Be interested in what that official does and their views about community and the work that they hope to accomplish as a leader in that community, and then concisely state your mission. You might even ask them, have you ever thought about what a clergy could do or a chaplaincy could do for this community, especially in times of crisis, if they are trained and prepared? Get their viewpoints. And then as you come to the close of your time with these individuals, ask the official if you could pray with them. And if so, offer a short, specific prayer. Present them a small gift like a pen or a small piece of literature or something handy that they could use day to day. And then, of course, leave your name card with contact information with them and with a secretary if there is one. When you get home, promptly write a short thank you note for the time that you spent with them in meeting. There's lots of agencies in a community, both business and labor, political liaison offices, and a whole host of ones that you probably are very concerned with. Businesses, they're concerned about profit and sustainability, marketing, productive employees, and crime, loss, security. We could go on with each of these departments for you to be aware of some of the issues that you could talk about. Adventists and other churches are often a little hesitant. They've had a history of opposing labor unions, and hence labor unions are often viewed negatively and consequently ignored. But some labor unions are beginning to see the necessity of a religious program among their members. And some have even provided chaplains for their members. One Seventh-day Adventist was asked to serve as a religious coordinator for a very large union and did so for several years, quietly. Chaplains are a resource, and especially during times that are uncertain and challenging. Chaplain Greg Matthews advocated that we mingle as Jesus did, meet people where they are, even if that means going to a picnic that is being held for union members and listening to their needs and responding without another agenda or giving and offering unrequested platitudes. Be transparent, he advises, about any obligation that you hear, and then know where you could make referrals and get help. So labor is a little unusual place that we don't often think about, particularly as churches, but there is a real need and an opportunity there. There are many local councils that you can go in and address yourself to, like the Better Business Bureaus or Chamber of Commerce or tourism offices, ministerial associations. Think of the various civic organizations that exist in your area. There may be veterans of foreign wars or of conflicts. Of course, the Red Cross or St. John or Red Crescents in your particular region. There are hospitals designated just for children, such as St. Jude's or the Shriners or Rotary International, which is for businesses, youth clubs of all kinds. And even ACM has certain working policy mandates about chaplains. Get acquainted with those and understand that ACM sponsors, particularly oversees, the work of our National Service Organization, which is the various military services. It goes beyond just those on active duty. It also provides for the spiritual well-being of church members who are serving in the military and caring for our Adventist veterans. When you go to meet these people, we have really nothing to feel hesitant about. I like that quote from Ellen White that says we have nothing to fear for the future, except if we forget our Lord's teaching and his leading in the past. Now I want to address, in particular, emergency operations in the local community. What do you do if you are a chaplain? You've been designated now, you're recognized, and an emergency happens. What goes on? Let's define an emergency crisis. Someone has said it is an unstable or crucial time or state of affairs of which the outcome will make a decisive difference for better or worse. There are several phases to the typical crises: emotional shock, followed by often denial, or even anger, remorse, grief, and reconciliation, and then hopefully recovery and restoration. You should be advised to know the signs and symptoms of an adverse reaction to a crisis, and look for it in all of the elements of the whole person, because they may not appear immediately and could come out later. What should you expect when you arrive on scene? Well, one thing, it appears often very overwhelming to the untrained or the inexperienced. Expect to find shock and chaos and confusion, even for a serious traffic accident that only may involve a handful of people. Disorder, people in a daze, kind of hurt and miserable. There could be screaming, curses even, blank stares, and zombies kind of wandering around just looking dazed, what happened type of expression. There might be ongoing fire or debris or dust and smoke from damage. And worse, you may see dead, mangled, or bleeding persons. And some persons will be attempting to help others. And then there are always the crowds of the curious onlookers. We call them rubberneckers. The first responders arrive. What are their priorities? First, to secure the scene for the safety of all on site, and begin to limit access to only those who need to be there. They have to establish leadership, someone who can coordinate the operations on scene. I didn't realize how different police and fire operate at a scene. Oftentimes it's the first officer on the scene that takes charge until a more senior person arrives and oversees and coordinates the scene. But in a fire, they're there for the long term, and often they're there for hours and maybe a day or two on the site. The first responders conduct triage, an event of multiple casualties or victims. That is, sorting who should get medical care and help first, and who may be designated to receive it a little less and lower on the priority. They give help to the injured, yes, and cover the dead. They're to call for additional resources as needed, and put out any fires as soon as possible. And then importantly also, they talk to witnesses and get information on what happened. And they may seem a little unconcerned about some things because they have these priorities that they've got to do and take care of. Here's a picture of a Homeland terroristic event. You may not have heard of it, but it was a federal building bombed in Oklahoma City some years ago that resulted in many deaths. There was a time, though, when the chaplain on the scene pulled together some of the first responders who wanted to have a season of prayer, and he gave a brief word of prayer for them as they were going into the rubble of this bombed out building to search for survivors or bodies. So you're the chaplain now. You're not one of the first responders, but you've been asked to respond to the situation. What do you do after being called out to a crisis? Well, first, you're going to grab what I call your go bag. It may be nothing more than a simple backpack, briefcase, or a larger bag of some kind of duffel. You're going to put that in your transportation, and pray en route and arrive safely. If you get in your car, for instance, and put pedal to the metal, and then you're hurt in an accident, you're no good to anyone. Your role is to arrive there safely. And then you report to the incident commander and any supervisory chaplain on site for instructions. They may assign you to a specific task or group, or they may even have you move to an off-site location to take care of family or friend. One thing I want to make sure you understand, you stay outside of any restricted areas unless you are authorized to enter. There's usually tape marked up saying, "Do not cross." Then, if you have been invited into an area, use the marked paths for entrance and exit. Don't just become another casualty. We had 2 deaths in the global war on terror, military chaplains who died unnecessarily because they couldn't follow safety instructions. Both of those deaths need not have happened, but they did. Your primary ministry on the scene is to the first responders. Let them work. This doesn't mean that you cannot minister to victims or assist as needed, but unless you are a doctor or a trained EMT, don't get in the way of those professionals giving medical aid to victims. You may want to move back a little bit to a collecting point where the injured are being readied for transport off the scene. And there you can take time to minister and talk with them and pray with them very briefly, so long as you are helpful on the scene and not in the way. Let's imagine a pretty grisly scene. There are lots of dead and injured. And it might be just a little bit too much for you if you haven't seen these kind of casualties. Ask to be excused for a minute. Go, be sick. You won't be the first person, and you're not going to be the last to do so. I've seen even police officers who do encounter these kind of things a little more frequently than we as clergy, not feel too well at the sight of somebody hanging on the end of a rope. You're simply going to reveal your humanity. Sometimes it is helpful, if you've never seen one, to watch an autopsy in a hospital or at a morgue. That may give you some experience to deal with some of these other events. But let me assure you, there is nothing pleasant about seeing injured and hurt people at scenes of death or auto accident or whatever. Observe first responders and affirm and support them. If I could briefly relate an incident. I was with officers on a ride-along, and we had a suicide threat. A lady had locked herself in her vehicle and was threatening to commit suicide. The officer I was with was first on the scene, and he began to try to talk and communicate with the woman, and a backup officer arrived. Now, I've had a little training in suicide prevention while I was a military chaplain, and I could have intervened, and I had lots of opportunity to interject into the conversation going on between the officers and this woman. But a third voice would probably have been distracting. And I chose to step back and observe, but be there if I was needed. The officers did a magnificent job. They convinced the lady to voluntarily unlock the door and put down her weapon, step outside, and agree to go in an ambulance to a hospital to get some psychiatric help. My role in that particular situation was to affirm these young officers and say to them, from my experience and training, you did it exactly right. I commend you for potentially saving this woman's life. That's what they needed to hear, because they were going to encounter that kind of a situation probably many more times throughout their career as a police officer. And if I could affirm and support them in that way, I was doing more of my job as a chaplain than if I tried to rush in there and interject myself into that conversation. So you need to know that you're there to support our first responders as much as to do ministry. Be prepared for serving more than a few hours. You might be there for 10, 12, maybe a couple days of 12 hours on and 12 hours off. So as needed, chaplains should schedule and rotate work in shifts. An Adventist chaplain can return to conduct Sabbath services and pull duty for other chaplains on Sunday. That's not hard. That can be thought of. Sometimes food and lodging is usually provided at these incidents, as I mentioned, I think earlier, on the fire departments. Then when they go out on a big fire, they may be there for hours or a day. They set up a small commissary to feed the firemen in their work. There are areas of focus that need chaplain ministries. First, the first responders. Watch for signs of traumatic stress. The families of first responders. They don't always know if that first responder is going to be home when expected. Families and friends of victims, survivors. And then most victims and survivors are going to be taken to an area hospital. A little follow-up might be appropriate. Make referrals as needed and be prepared for complications. Why? Because many families have no plans for next of kin funerals. They have no wills, no other legal documents. They don't know what's going to happen to the deceased, where they might be taken. And so you can come prepared to provide them some of that information. Now, more importantly, maintain confidentiality, because you are being given privileged communication by individuals who see you as an authority figure, maybe even as a priest. And they expect in return that the information they are privileged and freely offer you will be kept confidentially. We'll talk a little more about that later. And then take care of yourself. Talk with a trusted professional or a peer about the impact of a situation upon you. You need also to get it out and to share it with someone who can be a good listener, not a judge. And then whatever, don't talk to the media unless you have been authorized to do so. That is so vital, because you're going to often have a microphone put in your face. I was downtown on Pennsylvania Avenue, just outside the White House, and a large group assembled. And they saw that I was a chaplain for the United States Secret Service. And they immediately came and said, "Oh, chaplain, we're so glad to see you. What do you do here?" I said, "I'm a chaplain for the officers of the Secret Service." "Well, we would like you to read a scripture, say a few words, and say a prayer here for our group." And I said, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. What? And they wanted to make you feel like you were some kind of reprobate or antichrist. But in reality, I could not give sanction to this group in an official status, if you can imagine, not knowing, first of all, what they're doing there, what their agenda is, etc., etc. So you must use some discretion and be careful about spotlighting. Lastly, at a crisis, there may be a need for debriefings. And I would suggest get some training in critical incident stress debriefings, how you do it, how you're part of a team, how you would conduct this time. Because in some cases, first responders are kind of the type A, tough guy or gal person, and they'll say something like this: the best way to overcome traumatic stress is just get back to work. If you can't take it, you need to find another job. Well, that's not true. That's simply not the case. Being affected by trauma and crisis is normal, because sooner or later, the abnormal facts of life, those kind of situations, surface psychologically, behaviorally, and spiritually. So get some training in some form of stress management, and then be prepared to, if needed, to conduct or be part of a team that conducts debriefings. I'd like to move to the last part, the last module of local government, and that's entitled Potential Events. You read the news, you hear it. There are so many types of tragedies, accidental, criminal, disease epidemics that we're undergoing right now, natural disasters, and of course terrorism and war. And I'm not going to belabor those points. You can read these, you're aware of them, you hear the news, you know what's taking place. There are criminal activities as well. There is one area that I would particularly like you to be aware of. There is an increase in human trafficking and sexual slavery, often involving underage minors. Learn the blue alerts, the signs, the symptoms of these kind of activities in your area. Someone has estimated that there are more slaves now, loosely interpreting that term, than existed with slavery in the 19th century. Well, that's debatable, but be aware that it is on the rise and is common in unexpected places. I attended a special seminar at Andrews University, and they brought in the Adjutant General for the state of Indiana. And he began to give some statistics about this issue for just his state. And it was shocking, the number of potential slaves, again using that term very loosely, that existed in Indiana. The other second area that I'd like to call your attention to is illicit drugs. Recently at a staff meeting out at our airport that I serve at, the chief of security there, the police, stood up and he said, "We've had a first in my whole career. We caught an individual trying to smuggle drugs out of the United States to a foreign country." One of the most dangerous drugs right now is fentanyl. A small amount can be a killer. And you should be aware that often it is mixed with other types of drugs, and it has a very dangerous effect. We are in the midst of a disease epidemic, but if you look at the slides that we provide you, these have been going on for some time. The Spanish flu in 1918 to 19 killed an estimated 40 to 50 million people worldwide. I remember as a boy the polio epidemic. For 3 summers we couldn't go swimming or be out with certain groups out of fear. And then of course Dr. Jonas Salk came up with the vaccine that almost eradicated that terrible disease. I had an uncle and a cousin, both affected, that still wear steel braces so that they can walk a little better than as a result of that disease than if they didn't have it. And of course with COVID-19, so far estimated, and this is the last statistic I could get on the web, 843,500 people have died as of 31 August 2020. Natural disasters, you're familiar with them, varying from tsunamis and wildfires, etc. You can see the list that we've provided here on a slide. There is another global pandemic that is often not discussed as much as it could be, and that is, on an average of every 40 seconds, somebody commits suicide. Over 800,000 deaths a year occur from suicide. The countries with the highest rates are in Eastern Europe, Russia and its former republics, Guyana in South America. South Korea surprisingly has a high level. The lowest rates are in the more troubled nations. And here among the United States, we're finding now more deaths from suicide than casualties in the global war on terror. Historically, Christians have viewed suicide as an unpardonable offense to God and mankind. And for many years, some faiths would not even honor a death, a deceased person who had committed suicide, with a memorial service or funeral. Some nations consider suicide self-murder and a crime. And then there is euthanasia, which is doctor-assisted death, and opioid overdoses that are contributing factors to high death rates in many Western nations. And of course, there's issues around terrorism and war that have created many deaths. It is estimated that in the 20th century, governments killed over 125 million of their own citizens. Think about that. Genocide. There's a term called mass casualties. This classification is not dependent on the numbers of victims, because a mass casualty incident is any number of victims, maybe even one, that it exceed the amount of resources normally available to provide medical care. There is what we call triage. It's a means to classify or to sort by allocation of treatment according to a system of priorities that is designed to maximize the number of survivors. And so there are usually 5 levels assigned to a patient. He gets one of those. Urgent care is given to patients first that need it most. In the military, the person who needs it most is often the one that can be returned the quickest to duty. Those with terminal illnesses or massive injuries that probably are not expected to live may receive minimal care last. There's a quote from Great Controversy, pages 589 to 590, that bears repeating at this point. Ellen White writes this: while appearing to the children of men as a great physician who can heal all their maladies, he, that is, Satan, will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Even now, he is at work. And she goes on to describe ways in which Satan is exercising his power. He sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint, and thousands perish by the pestilence. These visitations are to become more and more frequent and disastrous. These are the times in which we're living. I don't know how more relevant that particular quote can be than what we're experiencing globally right now. So what is a chaplain response? When you hear of a crisis and there's death, let me suggest you go, you make contact, and you be present, particularly for a line of duty deaths among first responders. An officer is shot, or he's hurt or killed in an auto accident, or in some other way, you be there. If there are suicides, it's important for you to respond. If there's a mass casualty incident of any type, more than likely you're going to be called out. And so you report to the commander of the incident or to the senior chaplain, again as we mentioned earlier, for assignment of your duty place and your shift. And be prepared for long hours, for even days of duty. You obtain accurate information about the situation, and then you give pastoral care to victims, to family, and friends. Be sure to properly identify the persons you visit to make sure you know that they are associated with that person who may have been hurt or deceased. And you never give out more information than needed to know. One of the questions you get asked, well, how did they die? How was it that they were killed? Simple answer, they died in a tragic auto accident. Maybe all the details that you should give as a chaplain. Because often you don't know, and you shouldn't guess. And unless authorized, as we mentioned, don't talk to the media or the press. Well, that ends our section here on local government, and I trust it's been helpful. Let me remind you, just in closing this half of our session, of the 3 modules or models for community chaplaincy. There is that collection of chaplains that are already working with agencies such as the police or in a prison or a hospital that is serving their community directly through a particular organization or agency. That's one model. The second model is that collective pool of chaplains that are called together, that are trained, that are known, that are listed, that are identified and recognized, and they are on call whenever an event occurs. They may be serving as a pastor or a chaplain or a rabbi in another situation, but when called, they will respond. And then the third one is, like I am at the airport, we're contracted. We're a nonprofit organization contracted by the airport to serve a specific mission, a specific institution as a chaplain to the people assigned that work there. Just as a way of review, our next section will be that of looking at the chaplain.